Right, so welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book To Believe in Women, What Lesbians Have Done for America by Lillian Faderman, and it's being discussed by Elizabeth Miller. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, and over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a very interesting book by Lillian Faderman. It was published in, I believe, 1999. And it does, as Joe said, and as the title says, it does focus on America. So it's called To Believe in Women, What Lesbians Have Done for America, a History. And so it is very US centered, but I think it will be interesting to everyone because, similar things certainly happen in many other countries. And I was really excited to read this book because first of all, it kind of follows on a bit from the book that we talked about of hers a few weeks ago, Surpassing the Love of Men, which was about women in same-sex relationships for several hundred years, from the 1600s to the 20th century. And this book is also about women in same-sex relationships, but it's about how they supported each other and how they worked together in these couples to get an amazing amount of things done. And I really didn't know, I didn't know much of this history. I mean, I knew, I guess, bits and pieces of it, but I didn't know much of it. And I think it's really history that's kind of been erased, which is why Faderman likely wanted to write the book and to bring back that history. And I know that she went into many archives of letters at various women's universities in the US, and many other sources. So she really dug deep into sources to find the information for this book. And it's really fascinating. And I recommend it to everybody. So if I could have the first slide, Joe. So I'll start with a few statements that she makes in the introduction, kind of explaining why she wrote the book and the thesis of the book. And she starts by saying, this is a book about how millions of American women became full citizens, educated, and capable of earning a decent living for themselves. It is also about how Americans developed a social conscience and adapted the goals of various reform movements into laws. But it departs from other histories in that it focuses on how certain late 19th and early 20th century women whose lives can be described as lesbian were in the forefront of the battle to procure the rights and privileges that large numbers of Americans enjoy today. Next slide, please. And then she goes on to sort of define her terms. And she says, many of the women at the center of this book would not have used the noun lesbian to describe their identity or been familiar with the word. However, based on their letters and journals, that term used as an adjective accurately describes their committed domestic, sexual, and/or affectional experiences. So she's using the word lesbian as an adjective that describes, in her view, the relationships that these women had, many of them throughout their lives. And these were intense woman to woman relating and commitment relationships. Another interesting thing about the book is that many of the women described, not just in the couples that she talks about, but the women in various spheres that she talks about in the book knew each other well. And their work overlapped in many cases. So there were women who were pioneers in social work, women who were pioneers in founding women's colleges, pioneers in public health, suffragists. And first of all, many of these women worked in more than one of these areas. And secondly, many of them knew each other and even supported each other's work in various ways. And Faderman argues that in their eras, lesbian arrangements freed these pioneering women to pursue education, the learned professions, and civil and social rights for themselves and others, much more effectively than they could have done if they'd lived in traditional heterosexual arrangements. Almost all the women in the book that she talks about, and she gives many examples, and almost all of them had a primary relationship with another woman that lasted for 20 years or more. Sometimes as many as 50 or 60 years they were in these relationships. And in some of the relationships, one woman acted as a homemaker, and in many other situations, both women had intense careers and acted as support for each other in furthering their work and making it possible for the other to do her work. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of quotes from women in the early 20th century, feminist women. So here's a quote from 1920 where Crystal Eastman said, "Two businesswomen can make a home together without either one being overburdened or overboard, but it is the rare man who can marry one of them and continue the homemaking partnership." And then there's a quote from the book describing a 1906 essay by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, where she expressed great relief that women no longer had to strive desperately to find a husband, and that more and more women were choosing to remain single and refusing to be, this is a quote from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, they were refusing to be yoked in marriage, which demanded that they give up the dream of self-realization. Next slide. And Faderman says, with regard to many of these women, it was impossible to determine which came first, the realization that it was important to remain single if they wanted to achieve, or the desire to achieve because they knew they must, since they did not want to marry. So I thought that was very interesting. That was a question that I asked myself while reading the book. And Faderman also recognizes that question and says, you know, it's a very difficult question to answer. Next slide. So the book is broken up into 4 sections, each of which have several chapters. And the sections are how American women got enfranchised, how America got a social conscience, how American women got educated, and how American women got into the professions. And when I first opened the book and I looked at the table of contents and saw these sections, I thought, okay, well, lesbians were involved in doing all of these things and getting women enfranchised and creating, you know, the field of social work and starting women's colleges and getting women into the professions. I really didn't know about all of that history. I mean, I knew about some of it, but not all of it. And so I was very sort of impressed and sort of surprised right away by looking at the table of contents. And the book definitely provides 400 pages of evidence backing up all of these sections, all of these subjects. Next slide. So it's a very long book, and I'm going to kind of pick out highlights of some of the points that most stood out for me. And I will sort of preface this by saying that all of the women, every single woman that she mentions here was in a long-term relationship with another woman. And there are even many that I wasn't able to mention. So it was an extremely common phenomenon, which I also didn't know, that there were so many female same-sex couples doing all of this work in all of these different areas. So when she talks about the long struggle in the US for suffrage, which went on over about 150 years, she says, from its inception, women's fight for the vote was largely led by women who loved other women and lived with them. 19th century wifehood and motherhood were not compatible with work for the suffrage cause. So she talks about Susan B. Anthony, who was the driving force for women's suffrage in the United States for 4 decades, beginning in the 1850s. And she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was, I will, in fairness say, was married to a man, but they worked together very closely for many years and had, they sort of launched the suffrage movement in the US with the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1850s. And then Susan B. Anthony continued to work on this issue for 4 more decades. She never married and had long-term relationships with several women. Frances Willard, who is the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was also in a long-term relationship with a woman, with women throughout her life. And she's very interesting because she began with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and her main issue originally was temperance, trying to get laws passed outlawing drinking, and also trying to protect women and children against the excesses that happened when men drank. And then she eventually turned to the suffrage movement and became extremely important in the suffrage movement. And the reason that she did that originally was because she felt that women having suffrage would support the temperance movement. But then she really sort of shifted her focus to suffrage. So she's a very, very interesting character. And she's actually from my area, from Evanston, which is near Chicago, where I live. Willard pointed out in her autobiography that the loves of women for each other grow more numerous every day, in these days when any capable woman can honorably earn her own support. So she was one of the earlier people to make the point that once women could support themselves and weren't forced to marry men simply to be able to eat and have a roof over their heads, many of them started choosing to earn their own support, and many of them started entering into committed relationships with other women rather than marrying men. The book also talks about Anna Howard Shaw, who was the strongest force for women's suffrage in the early 20th century. She died in 1919, just before the US Senate passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. And she also had lifelong relationships with women who nurtured her and supported her work. Shaw was really a powerhouse. She lectured on women's rights for more than 30 years in every state in the US. And it's estimated that probably 5 million people heard her speak over the years about suffrage. Then there was Carrie Chapman Catt, who worked with her partner Molly Hay for many decades on suffrage issues in the US and Europe. And Catt convinced President Woodrow Wilson to support the constitutional suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment. And he then in turn convinced Congress to approve the amendment in 1919. Once Congress approved the amendment, it then had to be ratified by 36 states in order to get it into the Constitution. And so Catt also worked on that. She worked on the ratification campaign around the country until 36 states had ratified it. Next slide. So after the 19th Amendment was ratified, there was what Faderman calls the long sleep of the post-suffrage years. Women had been working on trying to get the vote since the 1850s, and or earlier really, and the vote was gotten in 1919. And at that point, women had been working so hard on this that there was sort of a lull, where Faderman says women seem to have no more appetite for a continued struggle. And those few who did were discouraged at almost every turn. And this is really interesting because it dovetails with something that we've talked about with regard to a number of books, that in the 1890s and sort of ramping up to the era around World War I, the sexologists and the Freudians were becoming extremely influential, and they were pushing this invert theory that said that women who were in relationships with other women or who were lesbians were damaged in some way. And this was becoming a very popular theory. And so along with that went sort of an increased worry in the culture that suffrage and other changes induced by women's rights, such as women studying at universities and having paid careers, especially in the learned professions, had created women with dangerously strong, quote, masculine personalities. And as I said, these theories were in the popular culture from the sexologists and the Freudians, and they were being absorbed by politicians and the public, including by many women. And so this was kind of discouraging, really poisoning the way that feminism was thought of, and discouraging a lot of women from even trying to be in the public arena. So there was a popular view that against feminism was that it was trying to make women into men. Next slide. Those women, Faderman says that those women who did attempt to get on the inside of politics on their own merits at this time in the 20s and afterwards were often unmarried and living with other women. And then she talks about the Ladies' Brain Trust, which was something I really had maybe heard a few words about, but really didn't know about. And this was absolutely fascinating to me. So Eleanor Roosevelt, the Ladies' Brain Trust was a group of women who were working with and friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt at the time when her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the president. And these women were able to be very influential in the government because Eleanor Roosevelt gave them access to FDR, and they were known as the Ladies' Brain Trust. So though not many women were winning elections in the decades after the 19th Amendment was passed, women did somewhat better in receiving appointments to various high political offices in the federal administrative or executive branch. And much of the success was due to Eleanor Roosevelt and the lesbian circle of women around her. Eleanor Roosevelt was responsible for numerous political firsts for women. She often suggested to FDR, when he was president, the appointment of women to political offices in the federal government. And these women then got direct access to FDR to suggest legislation. And most of these women were in same-sex relationships. As one example, a very influential woman, Molly Dawson, was the director of the women's division of the Democratic National Committee, which she built into one of the most effective components of the Democratic National Committee. And the members of the women's division were responsible for presenting to FDR some of the most innovative aspects of the New Deal, such as legislation on the very first legislation on minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance. They suggested all of these types of legislation, many of which were put into law as a result of the New Deal under FDR. Also, Dawson's friend, Frances Perkins, was appointed to FDR's cabinet as the Secretary of Labor. And she was the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the US government. Also a lesbian. Next slide. I was just, you can imagine, as I'm reading this book, and reading about all of these women, some of whom I'd certainly heard of Frances Perkins, and Eleanor Roosevelt, and I just sort of was struck by, example after example of these women in lesbian relationships who had this enormous impact on government and education and the professions. And Faderman's, I would say Faderman's thesis seems to be like, when you don't have to, when these women didn't have to take care of a home and family and children at a time when it was much more difficult to do that, even than it is now, they had an enormous amount of time to devote to doing all these other incredible things. So that's all I'm going to say for now about the suffrage section of the book. Then the next section of the book is called How American Women Got a Social Conscience. And it's all about the progressive movement in the US and how much impact women had on that. So it starts out by talking about Jane Addams, who is also from Chicago. And in her account of how she founded one of the first settlement houses in the US, Jane Addams described her terrible depression after she received her college degree in 1882, when she had no idea what to do with the rest of her life. she took a finishing trip to Europe, meaning these were trips that sort of genteel ladies would take to Europe to get culture and then return home to the US and get married. So she took a trip like that. And in East London, she saw up close the wretched poverty and misery that most people lived in. This made her understand that her modern education that stuffed a young woman with culture and nothing more was useless. And so she returned to Chicago and founded the first settlement house, which was called Hull House in Chicago, which is still there and still active. And the purpose of this settlement house was that educated women could operate independently of their families and could help people in need. And by founding this settlement house, she was establishing the social work profession, which is one of the first professions which is one of the few professions that has always been consistently dominated by women. Faderman says Adams was a central figure in progressivism and a moving force in America's transition from the laissez-faire society of her youth to the welfare state that America became in the years before her death. So she sort of presaged a lot of the ideas that later were underlying the New Deal under FDR. Next slide, please. So Hull House began one of the most effective social reform movements in America. It addressed itself to correcting urban ills in all areas, support for new immigrants, day nurseries for working mothers, college extension courses that established the night school movement. So the night school movement is very important in the US. It was a movement that provided college courses that people could take at night, which meant that working people could get college degrees. There was no other way that they could get college degrees because they weren't able to go to college during the day and full time because they were working. And so the night school movement is extremely important for enabling people to get college degrees and move out of the working class in many cases. Hull House also was involved with the establishment of trade unions, which met at Hull House, and the first vocational training courses and many other things. Adams, when I say that she created the field of social work, another thing that she did was organize research and investigation teams of female social scientists who had been trained at the University of Chicago, which had just been founded in 1893. And the research by these teams was used in successful campaigns for tenement ordinances, legislation on child labor and exploitation of working women, establishment of the first juvenile courts, and various other things. So that was another thing I found really fascinating about the book was that a lot of these women either did research or did work on their own and in the private sphere, which later led to them proposing legislation, which in many cases was groundbreaking legislation in areas where there had never been legislation before, helping women, children, working people, and other marginalized people. Adams also worked on national legislation on child labor. She played a major role in founding the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, which is one of the main African-American organizations in the US. And she also helped found the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. She was also a prominent pacifist who eventually won the Nobel Prize for Peace. So she was quite a busy lady. And the settlement house concepts and movement were the inspiration, as I said, for the social welfare legislation of the progressive movement and later the New Deal. She also worked with Theodore Roosevelt, who was the uncle of FDR and was also president before FDR. And he was a major force in the progressive movement, and he worked closely with Jane Addams and helped get a lot of her ideas into law. Next slide, please. Okay, now I will talk about the next section of the book, How American Women Got Educated. So Faderman starts by saying that in the 18th century and early 19th century America, education of females from any social class or economic class was minimal. In the 1830s, a woman named Mary Lyon, along with her partner Zilpah Grant, decided to found a seminary for girls that would be equal to what boys were taught. In 1835, Mary founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which became the first of the what we call here the Seven Sisters Women's Colleges that were meant to compete with the Ivy League, because the Ivy League completely excluded women from attending. And if you're not American, you may not have heard of Mount Holyoke, but it still exists, and it's one of the very prestigious female colleges, and these Seven Sisters women's colleges, along with Smith and Vassar and Bryn Mawr and several others that are just very top liberal arts colleges in the US still today. So the focus at Mount Holyoke was classics and hard science, and it was meant to prepare women to be serious scholars and independent beings through a career in education. I didn't actually realize that Mount Holyoke had been founded as early as 1835. I mean, that's really very impressive to me that they managed to get this done at that early date. So they were really the first serious women's college that wasn't just sort of a finishing school or a school that taught women sort of womanly arts. But these colleges did proliferate after the Civil War because 600,000 men died and women were needed to take their place in many occupations that required advanced education. So after the Civil War, a lot more women's colleges were founded. One thing I noted was that another lesbian couple, Sophia Packard and Harriet Giles, in 1881 founded Spelman College, which also still exists and is a very prestigious college. That was the first college for African American women. After the Civil War, as African Americans were entering the paid workforce, many of them had been prevented from learning to read and write, and so there was a lot of need for them to get education, and a lot of lesbians were involved in helping educate them and helping them get opportunities, and including founding Spelman College in 1881. Next slide. So the majority of women who graduated college by the early 1890s were likely not to marry at all, and even female graduates of coeducational institutions were much less likely to marry than women without college degrees. I thought that was very interesting. So that was really because when they had this education, they were much more likely to be able to enter into professions that required advanced education. And so from 1885 to 1905, there was also a proliferation of professions that enabled educated women to become self-supporting. And many of the women studying or teaching at women's colleges were in lifelong couples with other women. So much so that these relationships were called Wellesley marriages. Wellesley was another one of the Seven Sisters women-only colleges. And there were so many couples there who were married to each other, female couples who were married to each other and teaching at the college, that these relationships were called Wellesley marriages, not just at Wellesley, but across the country. That was a phrase that was used. They were either called Boston marriages or Wellesley marriages. Faderman quotes from a 1903 article called Confessions of a Woman Professor, where the writer says, and I think this kind of sums up the overall sort of attitude of women in this position who sort of their reasons for deciding to be in relationships with women instead of men was partly because they wanted to be able to focus on their life's work, and they felt that that was what would allow them to do that. So this writer of this 1903 article says, I refuse to exchange the work to which my best efforts and dearest ambitions have been given for the considerably overestimated boon of being supported. And she didn't say by a man, but I put that in brackets because that's what she meant. That was her explanation for not marrying a man. Next slide. Okay, then Faderman talks about several individual women who founded colleges and medical schools around this time, and I found their stories really interesting. So I wanted to focus on a couple of their individual stories. So in 1883, a woman named M. Carey Thomas, who was only 26 at the time, wrote to a prominent trustee of Bryn Mawr College, which is another of the Seven Sisters colleges, which was being founded at that time. And she wrote to him offering herself as its first president, which I thought was very gutsy for a 26-year-old to say, hey, I think I should be the president of this college. She was the first woman to ever receive a PhD from the University of Zurich. And she had to go there because there was nowhere for her to receive a PhD in the United States. She believed that women's colleges should have curricula of the same rigor as men's and should be headed and taught by women professors. She believed that the purpose of these women's colleges should be to prepare women to be scholars and professionals. And she had a wealthy partner named Mary Garrett, who was very instrumental in getting Bryn Mawr to hire Carey Thomas as its president by offering them $10,000 a year for as long as Thomas would remain its president. And $10,000 a year in 1883 was a huge amount of money. One thing that Faderman pointed out about M. Carey Thomas that I thought was interesting was that she had a history of being attracted to both men and women, but chose to partner with women because she felt that heterosexual marriage would threaten her ability to do scholarly work, whereas marriage to a woman would encourage that ability because the woman would be her equal partner. And that definitely turned out to be true because her partner also later raised the money to found Johns Hopkins Medical School, which continues to be one of the most prestigious medical schools in the United States. And so they worked on raising that money, and then her partner, Mary Garrett, actually donated about half the money on the condition that Johns Hopkins Medical School would admit women, which it did. And it was one of the first medical schools co-educational medical schools to admit women. Then Faderman also talks about a woman named Mary Woolley. So Mount Holyoke had already been founded, but she became its president in 1901 and greatly expanded their academic programs in the hard sciences, social sciences, and humanities because she believed that the purpose of Mount Holyoke or all women's colleges should be to train women for professions, for the learned professions. And she hired only women professors. And she was president until 1935 when she was replaced very much against her will by a male president. She campaigned for the next president to be female, but the times were kind of changing by then, and they chose a male president who mostly hired male professors after that, which was extremely disappointing to Mary Woolley and I'm sure to many other people. Next slide. Mount Holyoke hiring a male president when it had only had female presidents since it had been founded about 100 years before was kind of symptomatic of what was happening in American society, sort of starting in the 20s and then ramping up in the decades after that. As I mentioned before, this pseudoscience field of sexology had taken hold, and it was convincing society that women's only vocation should be marriage. So there was really a regressive shift in the way that society was viewing women's purpose, starting in the 1920s after a period since maybe the 1870s or 80s where there had been a progressive shift toward women getting more and more of a role in society and more education and more entrance into the professions. So in 1928, Carl Jung wrote an essay observing that homosexuality among women was prevalent among those who have notions about women's rights and advancement. So I thought that was a very interesting quote, that he was sort of warning that people who think that women should have rights and advancements are probably lesbians, and so definitely not to be trusted. Women's colleges were shifting at this point, and they were now really changing their focus to educate women for what they considered a woman's life and a woman's proper role. And they were castigating the previous generation for having pretended that there were no differences between the sexes and for foisting on women what they called an education designed for men. And Faderman gives some very depressing statistics. At Smith College, another one of the Seven Sisters colleges, in 1910, women made up 75% of the faculty. But by 1966, less than 35% of the faculty were women. And male college presidents in the mid-century were writing books insisting that young women were best served by an education that taught them to make the home peaceful and comfortable, that was the purpose of their college education. And by mid-century, more women were attending college. So the numbers of women attending college had greatly grown. But college was increasingly seen not as a preparation for them to enter professions, but rather sort of a finishing school credential to show that you were a reasonably cultivated, non-working class female. So it was seen kind of as a credential to attract a good husband. And I actually remember my mom, who went to Barnard in the 50s, saying that a lot of the women that she went to Barnard with were there to get their MRS degree, meaning their Mrs. degree, meaning that they were a Mrs. married to a Mr. And actually, that was why my mom left Barnard, because she was not there to get an MRS degree. She was there to get a PhD. And so she left to go to the much more intellectual University of Chicago, where women were focused on being educated and becoming professors, and not just on getting a husband. So a 1950s study of women who received PhDs showed that an unmarried woman had a far better chance of completing a PhD than a married woman. Next slide, please. All right, so that was the section on education and colleges. Now I'll start talking about the section on how American women got into the professions. Women in lesbian relationships in America pioneered women's entrance into the learned professions. In the 19th and early 20th century, women who entered and remained in the learned professions of medicine, theology, and law were usually unmarried and usually partnered with another woman. So Faderman talks about a woman whose name I'm going to mispronounce, unfortunately, Marie Zerkweska. Maybe if we have anyone from, I think she may have been of Polish extraction. Maybe someone in the chat can tell us how to pronounce her last name. But at any rate, in 1862, she founded the New England Hospital for Women and Children, which served the poor and was staffed entirely by female doctors. So I was so impressed that she was able to found a hospital in 1862 that was staffed entirely by female doctors. And this hospital continued to exist into the late 20th century. Much more than any other profession, success as a lawyer required qualities such as assertiveness that were diametrically opposed to those that a Victorian woman was supposed to have. And so women had even more difficulty becoming lawyers and successfully practicing as lawyers than they did as doctors. In 1910, when there were more than 9,000 female doctors in the US, there were only 558 female lawyers. Faderman talks about how those who partnered with women had a better chance of surviving law school and being able to practice law. And this was especially true because most law firms would not admit women, would not hire women to work for them. So if women wanted to actually practice law after they finished law school, they either had to start their own practice, or there were a number of women who started practices with their husbands. But Faderman also talks about Mary Perry and Ellen Martin, who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1875 and established a law practice in Chicago, which was probably the first female law partnership in the US. And they were also domestic partners. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first US Supreme Court justice, graduated from law school in, I think, the 40s or 50s. And I believe she was #1 in her class at one of the top law schools in the US, and she could not find a job. No one would hire her. And so that just sort of shows you what the situation was like for many years for women who went to law school. So in medicine, women were more successful in getting jobs. And that was partly because they carved out niches in areas where it was thought that women would have an advantage in practicing these kinds of medicine, such as pediatrics, obstetrics, and also fields that they themselves developed, such as preventative medicine and public health. Women were very instrumental in founding these fields like preventative medicine and public health. Faderman points to statistics that between the 1850s and 1930, close to 70% of female doctors who practiced for any length of time were not married to men. And she gives many examples of female doctors who formed long-term domestic relationships with other female doctors. Two women that she talks about a lot who were really extremely impressive women were two sisters, Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell, and they founded the New York Infirmary for Women and Children in 1857. And then after, again, 1857, this is so impressive to me. After the Civil War, they also founded the Women's Medical College, which was associated with the New York Infirmary Hospital. And Emily ran that college for the rest of her life. And this was the first, another innovation was that this was the first pairing of a medical college with a hospital. So that's very common. I don't know if it's common in other countries, but it's very common in the US for medical colleges to be associated with a hospital so that the students can be trained at that hospital. And this was the first time that that was ever done. It was also the first college to establish chairs in the areas of hygiene and pathology, and they were also a pioneer in preventative medicine. And Emily was in a domestic partnership with a faculty member at the college named Elizabeth Cushier. The college itself was absorbed into Cornell Medical School when that was founded in 1899, but the infirmary, the hospital, continued to serve poor women and children until the 1970s. And it also, very importantly, continued to provide a place where female doctors could serve their internships and residencies and become heads of hospital departments because they weren't generally given those opportunities at other hospitals. She also talks at length about Martha Elliott and Ethel Dunham, who were two women who went through medical school together, had a 60-year domestic partnership from 1910 to 1969, and had storied careers as medical researchers in community health and as professors at Yale School of Medicine. And I don't have time to talk more about them, but they both had many, many achievements that are discussed in the book. So I suggest that you read the book and especially read about Martha Elliott and Ethel Dunham because they both achieved an enormous number of incredible things. There is then, unfortunately, a chapter about how women lost ground in the professions. There was a period from the 1920s to around 1970 where women were losing ground in the professions, partly due to changing public attitudes that were caused by various societal institutions. So we've talked a number of times in these webinars about the sexology movement. And in the 1930s and 40s, this was becoming very, very influential in society. there were a number of psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists who were writing studies and books where they connected an interest in aggressive occupations and the movement for social equality of the sexes with lesbianism. And so their conclusion or their prescription was that to counter potential lesbianism among women, young women should be forced to perform feminine tasks and not allowed to do masculine tasks, or to sort of head toward masculine professions. One study recommended that unmarried teachers be fired so that, for one, they could not negatively influence girls, by which I think the study meant that unmarried teachers would be suspected of being lesbians and suspected of being a negative lesbian influence on girls. And so they should be fired for that reason. And in addition, they would be forced to marry men once they lost their jobs. So these studies were very aggressive in trying to shape society and shape the choices that women had. Another influence at the time was popular culture. So Faderman talks about how there were many, many magazine articles, some of which she summarized. And these magazine articles in many popular journals and magazines of the time proclaimed that women's financial independence was driving a wedge between husband and wife and harming the children, and would create an increasingly high divorce rate. And so, that meant that women's financial independence was a bad thing. Also at the time, Hollywood was making a lot of movies showing so-called strong-minded females who were brought down in the movie and learned to become real women by turning their back on careers and getting married. Even more disturbingly, after World War II, there were many attacks not only by psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists, but also by members of Congress who attacked federal judges, women who are federal judges, who senators tried to prevent from being appointed or promoted to higher courts because they were suspected of being lesbians. And lesbians who continued to work in the public sphere in these decades had to be covert. So they could no longer sort of talk in a matter-of-fact way about their female partner, but had to hide the fact that they had female partners. And one example that Faderman talks about is Pauli Murray, who is a very important and influential Black lesbian lawyer who worked on the Brown v. Board of Education case, which ended school segregation in the US. She also helped found the National Organization for Women. She also wrote a very influential legal memo that helped get sex added as a category for non-discrimination to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was originally written to counter race discrimination, and that was the impetus behind it and the reason for it. But sort of at the very last minute, at the 11th hour, sex was added as another category on which people could not discriminate. And that's continues to be extremely important up to the present day. This 1964 Civil Rights Act is still one of the main pieces of US legislation that outlaws sex discrimination. And Pauli Murray wrote this very important legal memo that helped get sex added as a category to that legislation. So, nevertheless, things were pretty bad from the 1920s to the late 60s or so. But things started to change back in a more progressive direction in the 60s. According to the 1960 census, women made up 65% of the increase in the labor force that had occurred during the 1950s. And by the 1980s, the percentage of doctors and lawyers who are female grew to nearly half. Nearly half of doctors and lawyers were female by the 1980s. The book was written in 1999, so she doesn't go beyond that in talking about the state of things. But I just found it to be a fascinating book. She did an enormous amount of research, and I really recommend it. So I think we might still have a few minutes if anybody wants to make any comments or ask any questions. Can we do that, Joe?
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A from
Ah,
Francine, and
okay.
I'll read it. Well,
Oh,
so
great. Yeah.
yes, yeah. So it says about the fight for suffrage in the US. I was wondering if, like the UK suffragettes, women there used violence sometimes, mostly against properties, but sometimes against men, like fighting against policemen or going after hostile politicians with whips.
There was not, that didn't happen nearly as much as it did in the UK. I believe there was a woman named, I think, Carrie Nation, who sort of led women in breaking windows in shops, I believe. But it wasn't nearly as common as in the UK. I don't actually know that much about why the suffragists here didn't come to see violence as being as necessary. But there wasn't as much violence here.
Oh, great. We've got Marion and Sheila coming on. So I'm going to leave it to you to have a little chat.
Yes. I mean, what I was very interested in, it's a fascinating book, clearly fascinating information, is how extremely similar things were that were happening in the US and in Britain, and doubtless in other countries as well. Because, of course, in Britain there was a settlement movement in the late 19th century, mostly led by women, called the University Settlement Movement, which did all the evening classes and so on. So what's interesting to me is that there was such communication clearly because they were doing similar things, and there were in the late 19th century yearly conferences of women, international conferences, and they somehow got to meet up. Extraordinary. And of course, this was way beyond before any kind of social media and so on. We were told, weren't we, that social media would be so wonderful because suddenly women would have the chance to speak to each other. Well, there was huge communication in the late 19th century, and of course in Australia as well, things were happening. So I think that how they communicated and how this international movement worked would be fascinating. And I wish there was a book on that, but I
Oh
don't
yeah,
know about a book on that.
that would be fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I assume they must have communicated by letter and
Yeah.
getting on ships to travel across the Atlantic to go to these conferences together. So, I mean, the amount of dedication they had to have to, cross the ocean to have these
Yeah.
conferences.
And I wouldn't know if I hadn't spent time in archives when I was writing my first book and found all this stuff about these international conferences. I would never have known. We just don't have that information. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that there are these archives where this information exists, and I'm really indebted to Faderman for going into these archives and finding it because a lot of the information is there. It's just that no one ever talks about it. And
No,
it's
and it,
very, as you know, Sheila, it's very difficult to go through archives. I mean, you're reading, individual letters that are written in
And
handwriting.
handwriting is very, very difficult. And of course, in the 1920s and 30s, there was the campaign against women teachers, and they stopped unmarried teachers from teaching, and then they stopped married teachers from teaching. I mean, it was just very difficult because they thought that women were a danger to children, really, especially because of feminism. So it's fascinating how similar the things were that were happening in both countries. And of course, we had our famous sexologists as well, who were absolutely horrendous, like Havelock Ellis, as you say. So very, very similar. And of course, we're now in one of these periods of backlash. I mean, it's all happening now. The attacks on lesbians now. The fact that lesbians are not allowed to meet separately, and young women suspected of being lesbians are being transgendered and having terrible medical harm done to them. So we are in one of those periods, and it's very fascinating to see what some of those tendencies might be that are taking place now. I don't know how far back we're going to go compared with what you were describing as happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s.
We can go pretty far back, and you mentioned, Liz, oh gosh, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. We did a book last year or maybe the year before called Sisters in Spirit about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the influence that contact with the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois nations had on them, and their, and how it was different in terms of the role of women. Society was, organized to maintain a balance of equality between women and men. Lucretia Mott visited the Seneca Nation. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was adopted by the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's cousin was named for an Oneida chief, and her closest neighbor was Onondagan, which are, it's all Indian tribes. But their culture was completely different. Women made the decisions about, do we go to war? Do we not go to war? Men were, and it was like, men were equal to women rather than the other way around. But that was greatly influencing on them. And the conference in 1848 was very much influenced by these principles. So that's, we go back to 1848, that one brief shining moment.
Yeah, it was in Seneca Falls, that conference, which is a part of upstate New York where there were many, many Native American tribes. So that's fascinating. Yeah, Faderman doesn't talk about any of those women you just mentioned. I mean, there's so many women to talk about that even a 400-page book can't even mention many of them. So I'm glad you did that book. That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a good book. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was actually ridiculed for her, there were caricatures, newspaper, cartoons about her with an axe breaking windows, and she's going for men's necks next.
Yeah. I see a comment that college archives are such a treasure trove. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I've worked in archives myself, and I really want to encourage women who have an interest in history to see what archives might be near you in universities or other places. And I think there's always a lot of untapped primary sources in those archives that maybe no one has ever really looked at before. And you can go and look at them and find out things about history and maybe write articles or books. I mean, archives really are a treasure trove, much of which has not really been looked at.
You have to be able to read cursive.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in now and say we have to stop. It's 11:02, which is a lot past our stopping time.
A lot past, yes.
Okay, so it's just good. We do need to stop because people are going to the breakout rooms. Thank you very much, everybody.
You're welcome.
Yes, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Bye.
Bye-bye.